Montana Territory, 1879. The wind carried dust and the smell of burnt coffee through the dry air when the girl was sold for 2 chickens and a length of rope. The bidding happened behind a saloon in the dying light of afternoon. She had no shoes, no name anyone cared to use, and no say in the deal. The man who traded her off was drunk and mean, the kind who spat when he talked and called her it. Grace Garrison stood silent while one man tied her wrists and the other walked off with his rope and chickens like he had won something. She was 20, maybe younger. Her dark hair hung in tangled ropes down her back, and her eyes had the look of someone who had stopped hoping for anything better. She did not fight. She had learned what happened when she did. Then came the voice. She is worth more than gold. It was not loud, just steady, calm. The man who spoke stepped into the alley's edge like he had every right to be there, tall and dust-covered from the trail. A rifle hung across his back, and his chestnut horse stood behind him with reins dragging. "Who the hell are you?" barked the buyer, squinting. The cowboy's name was Weston Albright. Folks called him West. He had been driving cattle through the territory and had only stopped for feed and a drink. He had not meant to get involved. But then he saw her. West's gaze stayed on Grace, not the man. "Let her go." "This is none of your business," the buyer snapped, stepping closer. West's hand rested on the rifle strap. He did not raise it. He did not have to. "2 chickens and a rope," he said, voice iron flat. "That what you think a woman's worth?" The buyer hesitated, then scoffed and yanked Grace's arm, making her stumble. That was when West moved. Grace barely saw it happen. 1 second, West was still. The next, he had the man on the ground with a knee to his back and his wrist twisted behind him. "I am not going to ask again," West said. The man cursed, spat, then finally let go of the rope. West stood, calm as spring water. The man scrambled up and ran off, cursing over his shoulder. Grace stayed still, rope still around her wrists. West stepped over and pulled a knife from his belt. He cut the rope clean, gentle. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded once. "You got a name?" "Grace," she said, voice hoarse. He nodded. "You got anywhere to go?" She shook her head. The truth was, she had not had anywhere to go for years. Her parents died of fever when she was 15, and she had been passed from hand to hand since. No one ever asked her name. West looked at her for a long moment. He saw the bruises on her arms, the way she barely met his eyes, the way she stood like someone waiting to be hit. "I got a camp a few miles out," he said. "You can ride with me. I got food, a spare blanket. You would be safe there." Grace hesitated. Men had said things like that before. They always wanted something, but something in his voice was different. He had not looked at her like property. He had not touched her except to free her. She nodded again. West helped her onto his horse and led them out of town before the sky finished going dark. They camped near a ridge where the grass was tall and the wind soft. West built the fire while Grace sat on a flat rock nearby. She held her arms close and kept her back to the light. He handed her a tin plate with beans and hard bread. "It is not much," he said, "but it is warm." She took it with both hands. "Thank you." He nodded and sat a few feet away, giving her space. "You from around here?" "No," she said quietly. "I was born near Wichita, got taken when I was 17. West's jaw tightened. "By who?" She shook her head. "Does not matter now." They sat in silence after that. Grace ate slowly, used to rationing. West leaned back on his elbows and watched the stars. "You got a family?" she asked finally. He nodded. "Had one, lost them in a fire 4 years back, wife and 2 daughters. I stopped riding after that. Took work driving cattle, fixing fences. Keeps me moving." Grace looked down. "I am sorry," he shrugged. "You do not need to be. Just how life goes sometimes." Grace looked at him then, really looked. He had kind eyes under the dust, a quiet steadiness to him. "You did not have to help me," she said. "I know." "Why did you?" He looked at her. "Because no one else did." She blinked hard and looked away. She had not cried in years. She would not start now. They rode together the next morning. West brought her to a small shack near the river he used between drives. It was plain but solid. A bed, a stove, a roof that did not leak. He offered her the bed. He took the floor. Grace helped with chores. She swept. She mended. She cooked what little they had. It felt strange being useful, not used. Some days passed like that. Quiet. Safe. One night, while West whittled by the fire, she sat across from him with her needlework. She looked up. Do you think a person can start over? She asked. West paused. I do, she nodded, looked down. Me too. He watched her for a long moment. Grace, he said. She looked up. You are not what happened to you. Something in her chest cracked open. She set down her sewing, stood, walked over and sat beside him, close enough to touch. He did not move. I feel safe here, she whispered. You are, he said. She looked up at him. Do you want me to stay? His voice was quiet. I do. She reached for his hand. He took it. They sat like that for a long time, fire crackling, hands held. And for the first time in years, Grace slept through the night without waking in fear. The river thawed in early May, and the mule deer began moving low along the cottonwoods. West cleaned out the stovepipe and patched a spring leak along the cabin's north wall. Grace planted sweetgrass and beans near the edge of the clearing, her hands deep in the soil, dirt under her nails. Neither of them spoke much during the days, and neither of them needed to. The quiet had become something they shared. One afternoon, while Grace scrubbed a shirt against the washboard stone by the creek, she looked up to see West returning from the ridge with 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder. His shirt was damp with sweat at the collar, and there was a notch of dried blood on his forearm. She met him halfway up the slope. You're hurt. He glanced down, scraped it on a mesquite thorn, didn't even notice. Come inside, I've got salve. He didn't argue. She cleaned the cut with boiled water and used a strip of old muslin to bind it once the salve was on. Her hands were steady, but her breath caught when he looked at her direct, unguarded. You always take care of people. I never had the chance to, she said quietly. He didn't press her. Just nodded, then said, You've got a good touch. Grace poured the last of the wash water onto the garden that evening. The shoots were coming up in crooked rows, and she had taken to checking them each morning like something sacred might rise from that soil. The next day, West wandered past the bluff to check the line traps and came back with a letter tucked into his vest. He handed it to her without a word, the envelope worn. The postman left it at the feed store in town last week. I hadn't been in till now. Grace turned it over in her fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning the page, her lips parted. It's from my mother's sister. I didn't know she was still alive. West waited. She lives near Bozeman, Grace said. Says she heard I was taken. She's been looking for me. He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked inside the stove. You want to go to her? I don't know. There was no tension in his voice when he finally said, You should if you want to. Grace folded the letter and stared at her hands. The woman she remembers isn't the one I am now. West leaned forward. She might surprise you. Grace looked up. You'd let me go. You're not mine to keep, he said softly. The days that followed passed with less ease. Grace moved slower, as if measuring each step. West spent more time by the horses, restitching worn tack or patching a saddlebag that didn't need it. On a cold morning in late May, Grace brought the letter out again and read it from the porch. West sat nearby, carving a new handle for the water bucket. She says her husband took sick last winter. She's alone now. He didn't look up. Sounds like she needs family too. Grace folded the paper slowly. If I go, I don't want it to mean I'm leaving this behind. West set the knife down. Then don't let it mean that. She stepped off the porch, crossed to him, and knelt beside his stool in the grass. I've never had someone look at me like I was more than what had happened to me. West met her eyes. You are. A breeze moved through the cottonwoods, slow and warm. She reached for his hand. I want to stay. I want to grow something here. He didn't answer with words. He just brought her hand to his chest and held it there, over the quiet, steady beat beneath his ribs. That night, they sat side by side on the porch, her head against his shoulder, the letter folded between them. Neither of them spoke about it again. The stars came out clear and sharp, and somewhere beyond the river, a whippoorwill called. In the morning, Grace tore the letter into strips and fed it to the fire. The flames took it slow, piece by piece, until nothing remained but ash curling upward into the chimney air. West brought in the last of the spring wood while she swept out the corners. They worked like that for the rest of the week, shoulder to shoulder, every motion a quiet vow. And when the summer came, the beans began to blossom. By mid-June, the mornings came in warm and gold, and the air smelled of pine sap and river stone. Grace had begun rising earlier, sometimes before the sky lightened, and West would find the stove already lit and coffee simmering when he came in from tending the horse. She never said much in those hours, but her eyes were steadier than they used to be, and her steps had taken on a quiet rhythm that matched the land. That Sunday, West hitched the mare to the buckboard. "Supplies run?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Thought we might go together." "Town'll be quiet this early." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Let me find my boots." The road curved through wind-worn hills, tall grass brushing the wagon wheels. Grace sat beside him, her bonnet tied loose beneath her chin, gaze fixed ahead. West didn't press her with talk. She'd been away from towns long enough that the thought of returning carried its own weight. By the time they reached the dry outskirts of Fort Shaw, most streets were still half-shadowed. They passed a few ranch hands leaning against the rail outside the general store. One of them straightened when he saw Grace, brow furrowed. West caught it but didn't look over. Inside, Grace walked the narrow aisles while West bartered with the clerk over flour and lamp oil. She traced her fingers across a bolt of calico, pale blue with small white flowers. When she turned to find him standing behind her, she dropped her hand. "Like that one?" he asked. "I was just looking." West picked up the bolt and placed it on the counter with the others. "We'll take 2 yards. Grace watched him, then said softly, "You don't have to, I know." Back at the cabin, he unloaded the wagon while she started a pot of stew. When he carried in the calico, folded neat and tied with string, she untied it without a word and set it on the table. Her fingers brushed the fabric, then stilled. "There's something I'd like to ask," she said later. As they ate near the open door, West looked up. "I'd like to learn to read." He set down his spoon. "I can teach you. I remember a little. My father taught me letters before he passed." "But it's been—" She shook her head. "I want to be able to write my name proper, maybe more." He gave a quiet nod. "We'll start tomorrow, after morning chores." The next day, West brought down a tattered primer from the shelf. Each evening after supper, they bent over the table together. Grace sounded out words in a low voice, careful and slow. West guided her only when needed. By the second week, she was writing short sentences on scraps of paper. One morning, he found her sitting on the porch, frowning over her work. She looked up when he stepped outside. "The sun is warm," she read, then held up the paper. "Did I spell it right?" He smiled. "You did." She folded the scrap and tucked it into her apron. "Feels good, learning something that's mine." That evening, she brought out a tin box and set it on the table. "I've been keeping these," she said, opening the lid to reveal slips of paper, each with a line she'd written. West leaned over the table, reading them without touching. Some were bits of memory, others were questions. One reads simply, "I am still here." She watched his face, cautious. "Is it foolish?" "No," he said. "It's brave." Later that night, as the wind moved through the cottonwoods, she stood in the doorway and listened to the sounds of the valley. West came up behind her, close but not touching. "You ever miss Wichita?" he asked. "Sometimes. But it's more the girl I was then. I don't think she made it." He was quiet a long moment before he spoke again. "I think maybe she grew into someone stronger." Grace turned to face him. The starlight caught the edge of her profile, soft and sure. "I never thought I'd feel something like this again," she said. He reached for her hand. "Neither did I." She didn't pull away. The porch boards creaked beneath them as they stood there, the quiet settling around their shoulders like the first hush of snow. No promises spoken, none needed. Just the steady press of 2 people who had learned to trust the slow work of time. The first thunderheads rolled in just after the summer solstice, deep gray and swollen with the promise of rain. West stood at the edge of the clearing, hat low against the wind, watching the sky press down over the valley. Grace stepped out onto the porch behind him, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, the scent of yeast and wood smoke still clinging to her. "Storm's coming," she said. He nodded. Ground could use it. They moved together without needing to speak further. West hauling in firewood, Grace covering the garden rows with burlap sacks she'd stitched from old flour bags. The air thickened as the clouds pulled low, and by the time the first drops hit the roof, the cabin felt folded safe into the hillside. Inside, Grace lit 2 oil lamps while West bolted the shutters. The wind came hard, bending the trees and rattling the eaves. Rain struck the tin roof like scattered nails. Used to be scared of storms like this, she said, kneeling to tuck a quilt around the window seam. What changed? I stopped having a roof over my head, she answered. After that, thunder didn't seem so loud. He crossed the room, crouched beside her. You've got one now. She nodded once, but her face had gone distant. West reached behind the hearth and pulled out a small wooden box worn at the corners. He set it gently between them, then opened the lid. Inside were a few paper items, a calling card, an old tintype of two girls in front of a wagon, a folded strip of paper browned at the edges. I haven't opened this in years, he said. Didn't see the point. Grace looked at him. Whose are they? My daughters, he said, tapping the photo. Clara and June. That was taken a few months before the fire. She didn't speak right away. Then, carefully, what were they like? Clara was all questions. Wanted to know how everything worked. June didn't say much, but she'd sit beside you for hours just listening to the wind. He traced the edge of the tintype with one thumb. They'd have been near grown by now. Grace looked down at the photo, then back at him. You don't talk about them. I didn't think I could. Not without losing something I couldn't get back. And now, he met her eyes. Now I think maybe some things come back in a different shape. The lantern flame flickered against the stone hearth, casting long shadows. Grace reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the box. I never had anything to keep. Not pictures, not names, just bits of memory I tried not to hold too tight. He closed the box and set it aside. Maybe we start making new ones. The storm rolled on, but it softened as the night deepened. Grace rose, took down the bread she'd set to rise earlier and worked it into loaves by lamplight. West watched her, silent, as she kneaded the dough with steady hands. Do you miss the trail? She asked. Sometimes. Not the dust or the sleeping on rock, but the space. The feel of sunlight on your back with nothing but open land ahead. She shaped the dough and placed it in the pans. You ever think about settling for good? I didn't, he said. Not until recently. She looked over her shoulder. And now, I've been thinking maybe the right place isn't out there anymore. Maybe it's right here. The air inside the cabin was warm, heavy with the scent of wet earth and rising bread. She turned to him, eyes searching his, and for a long beat they didn't move. I want to build something that lasts, she said, not just survive. You're not surviving anymore, he said. You're living, she stepped closer. I don't know how to do this. I never learned what a good life looked like. He reached for her hand. Then we learn it together. Outside, the storm moved east, leaving behind a world rinsed clean. When morning broke, the sun rose over a valley washed in gold, and the first new sprigs of wild mint pushed up through the wet soil along the creek. Inside the cabin, 2 loaves cooled on the table, and beside them, a folded slip of paper in Grace's careful hand. Home is where I am not afraid anymore. By the time July settled into the valley, the bees had made a home in the hollowed cottonwood near the bend in the creek, and the meadow beyond the ridge was heavy with yarrow and wild flax. Grace took to rising just past dawn to walk the edge of the field, collecting what she could in her apron, roots for tinctures, herbs for teas, leaves she pressed between pages of the primer West had taught her from. One morning, she returned to find West kneeling by the shed with a length of pine wood balanced across his knees. His brow was furrowed, hands working slow and careful with the drawknife. You building something? She asked, setting her bundle on the porch rail. Thinking of putting up a smokehouse, he said, not looking up. Wouldn't need much, just a stone base and some split boards. Be better than salting everything come winter. She stepped down beside him, crouching to examine the grain. You've been planning. I have. He set the blade aside and met her eyes. I'd like to stay here for good, Grace, not just pass through. Her fingers brushed the edge of the timber. I'd like that. Later that evening, they sat by the riverbank. West leaned back on his elbows, boots dug into the soft earth, while Grace strung mint stems into a bundle for drying. The river moved slow and full, its surface catching the last of the daylight. Do you ever feel guilty, she asked, for being happy? West let the question settle before answering. Sometimes, but I try not to let it take hold. I carried it for so long it started to feel like part of my spine. He turned toward her, voice even. You don't owe the past your joy, she nodded, eyes still on the water. I want to believe that. You don't have to believe it all at once, just enough to stop flinching when good things happen. That night, the wind shifted cooler. They left the windows open and lay side by side beneath the old quilt. Grace turned into his shoulder, her breath soft against his collarbone. "I've been thinking," she said, voice low, "about marrying." West held still. "I don't want it because of what people expect. I want it because this is the first time in my life I've chosen where I stand." He reached for her hand under the quilt. "Then let's stand together." They married under the cottonwoods 5 days later. No preacher came, no papers were signed. Just two voices, an oath, and a sky full of hawks circling high above. Grace wore a dress she'd sewn from the calico West had bought months back. He tied a thin strip of leather around her ring finger, carved with a small crosshatch pattern, like the one on his saddle horn. "I never thought I'd see this day," she whispered as they stood beneath the trees. "You're not just seeing it," he said. "You made it." The weeks that followed unfolded steady. Grace dug a second garden bed for onions and squash. West finished the smokehouse before the first frost crept down from the high hills. They slept close each night, winter pressed firm against the windows, the stove ticking warm beside them. In early December, Grace found herself breathless one morning, nausea curling sharp behind her ribs. She kept silent for a few days, watching her body with a practiced eye. On the 5th morning, she sat at the edge of the bed, her back to West. "I think I'm carrying," she said. He rose slowly, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You sure?" "I've known my body a long time. It tells me things whether I ask or not." He knelt beside her. "How do you feel?" She looked down at him, eyes full. "Like I've been handed something delicate and whole." He said nothing, only pulled her into his arms and held her until the light crept full into the room. They spent the winter preparing trading dried meat for cloth and a cradle frame, lining the walls with extra wool, mending the roof seam above the bed. Grace's belly rounded beneath her apron, her steps slower but still certain. Spring came early that year. Snow melted from the ridge faster than usual, and the creek ran high with runoff. On a warm April morning, just after the first crocus bloomed near the porch, Grace went into labor. It was long, nearly a day, but not hard the way she'd feared. West never left her side. At dusk, a cry rose through the cabin walls, small and sharp and alive. "A girl," Grace whispered, voice hoarse but sure. West wrapped their daughter in the soft muslin Grace had stitched with tiny blue stitches along the edge. He laid her in Grace's arms, then sat beside them, the weight of the moment settling deep into his bones. "She's got your eyes," he said. Grace looked down at the sleeping child. "And your steadiness." They named her June, not for what was lost, but for what had returned years past. The cabin grew with them, first a back room, then a lean-to for tools, eventually a second bed for June when she grew too long-legged for the cradle. Grace taught her letters using the same primer West had once held between her fingers. West built her a wooden horse from scrap pine, painted with leftover whitewash. Grace never flinched again when she laughed. West no longer woke reaching for what wasn't there. Their days were full of soil and wood smoke, of sun-warmed hands and quiet evenings. They did not speak often of the lives they'd left behind. There was no need. Everything they had built said it for them. And when summer came again, the meadow bloomed with wild flax, and the bees returned to the cottonwood, and Grace stood at the door with June in her arms, watching West come up the path with a satchel of seed on his back and a smile that reached the corners of his eyes. She knew. She had not just survived, she had chosen this, and been chosen in return. They lived the rest of their days in the valley, growing deeper into each other with every passing season, their love marked not by grand declarations, but by the quiet, enduring kind of devotion that never needed to be spoken aloud again.